The message came in at 12:45 a.m., a faint buzz against the deafening quiet of my room. I stared at it, heart thumping, caught between curiosity and hesitation. It was her, my Tinder match. "What are you doing right now?" I hesitated, glancing at the clock. It was late, but her follow-up came quickly. "Come out with me." For a moment, I thought about saying no. It was cold outside, and the last time I let my guard down, it had cost me 3 years of my life and left me in pieces. But then, the voice in my head reminded me, "You're single now. Take the chance. Live a little." "I'll pick you up," she added. That sealed it. My heart raced as I threw on my best shirt, splashed on cologne, and checked myself in the mirror one last time. Confidence wasn't my strong suit these days, but tonight felt like it could be the start of something new, or at least a distraction. The car pulled up a few minutes later, headlights cutting through the stillness of the street. I stepped out, half nervous, half excited. But when I opened the car door, my stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. My match sat in the passenger seat, flashing a quick smile, but behind the wheel was another woman, a friend apparently. I hesitated for a second before sliding into the back seat. Weird, but maybe they were just cautious. Women had their reasons for traveling in pairs, I guessed. "Which club are we heading to?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "We're not going out," my match said, twisting to look at me, her voice airy and nonchalant. "Just out." I frowned. "Where exactly?" "Just into town," she said, offering no further detail. The conversation fell flat after that. The car ride was awkward, filled with random chatter between them that excluded me almost entirely. My gut tightened with every mile. Something was off, but I wasn't sure what. Soon, we pulled into an empty car park under a bridge, the space dimly lit and eerily quiet. The driver killed the engine, leaned back, and pulled out a 1-liter bottle of chocolate milk. My match seemed unfazed, laughing along as her friend drank straight from the oversized container like it was a bottle of champagne. They turned the radio up, rolled cigarettes, and started chatting about the most mind-numbing nonsense, stuff I couldn't even pretend to care about. Minutes dragged on like hours. I kept glancing at my phone, wondering if this was some kind of test or cruel joke. After 15 minutes, they got out of the car to smoke. I followed, the frigid air hitting me like a slap. And that's when I saw it, my match stepping out in fluffy white slippers that lit up with every step. I stared, blinking, unsure if I was seeing things. She shuffled around the gravel, her glowing feet an absurd sight against the grim backdrop of the bridge. The unease boiled over into irritation. What was I even doing here? I'd agreed to step outside my comfort zone, but this was something else entirely. I turned to face them, hands shoved deep in my pockets. "Look," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I appreciate you picking me up, but this really isn't my scene. I think I'm going to head off. Have a good night." Their faces froze, the surprise quickly morphing into offense. "Seriously?" My match scoffed, the light from her slippers flickering as she shifted her weight. The driver muttered something under her breath, shaking her head. I didn't care. I walked away, my breath fogging in the cold night air, each step lighter than the last. The discomfort, the awkward silence, the glowing slippers, it all felt like the universe's way of reminding me I deserved better. That night wasn't the start of something new, but it was the end of pretending to settle for anything less than what I truly wanted. Sometimes taking a chance means walking away. The restaurant buzzed with the warm chatter of other diners, their voices blending with the clinking of silverware and the soft hum of background music. I sat stiffly at the table, trying to steady my nerves. It had been a long time since I'd been on a date. Too long, thanks to the emotional wreckage of a 3-year relationship that had ended in flames. But here I was, determined to try again, pushing myself to embrace the terrifying world of dating. For 2 weeks, I'd been talking to this guy. On paper, he seemed great, funny, charming, and no glaring red flags. Our conversations had been light, easy, the kind that made me think maybe, just maybe, I was ready to move on. When he asked me out to dinner, I said yes, hoping this was the first step toward something good. He arrived a little late, all smiles and confidence as he slid into the booth across from me. The dim lighting cast soft shadows over his face, making him seem almost too perfect. "Sorry I'm late," he said, brushing off the apology with a wink. Traffic was a nightmare. I smiled politely, nerves still fluttering in my chest. The waitress appeared quickly, handing us menus and taking our drink orders. I ordered a soda, eager to keep my head clear, and he ordered some craft beer that he clearly thought was impressive. We started chatting, the kind of awkward small talk that felt like trudging through knee-deep mud, but I figured that was normal for a first date. Then, somewhere in the middle of explaining why I hadn't been out much lately, I said, "I've been saving up for a washer and dryer. Mine broke a while ago, and I've been trying to budget for replacements." He leaned back in his chair, smirking like he knew something I didn't. "You know," he said, his voice casual but laced with something sharp, "instead of saving for that, you should save for a boob job." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My brain froze, the words hanging in the air between us like a bad joke waiting for a punchline. But the punchline never came. He was dead serious. I stared at him, stunned into silence. My stomach churned, and my cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger. Before I could even figure out how to respond, he doubled down. No, it's not a bad thing," he said, waving a hand as if he was doing me a favor. "My sister and mom both had small tits, and they got boob jobs. They look amazing now." I blinked, my mind reeling. Did he really just say that? To me? On a first date? Before we even had our drinks? My throat tightened, a lump of indignation forming as I tried to comprehend the sheer audacity. He just sat there, looking at me like he'd offered sage advice, like he expected me to thank him for his thoughtful suggestion. I glanced around the restaurant, suddenly hyper-aware of every other table. Couples laughed, groups clinked glasses, and servers wove between tables, oblivious to the humiliation burning through me. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue or demand an explanation. I just stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing a few curious glances from nearby diners, but I didn't care. Let them stare. Let him sit there and wonder what he'd done wrong. The cold night air hit me like a slap, a welcome contrast to the suffocating heat of the restaurant. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the pavement, adrenaline surging through my veins. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, the part that had been worn down by heartbreak and self-doubt. By the time I reached my car, the initial shock had faded, replaced by a simmering anger. How dare he? How dare anyone think they could comment on my body like that, as if it was their right to decide what I should or shouldn't change. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. The absurdity of it all hit me then, and I laughed, sharp and bitter, but a laugh nonetheless. This wasn't the start of a love story, but maybe it was the start of something better. A reminder that I didn't have to settle, didn't have to endure thoughtless comments or gross entitlement just to feel wanted. A notification from Tinder. I checked it, my pulse quickening out of habit. A match had messaged me. Her profile had caught my eye earlier, sharp wit in her bio, a mischievous glint in her photos. I'd been hopeful. "Hey, what's up?" I typed back, keeping it simple, not wanting to overthink it. Her response came almost immediately, but it wasn't anything I could have anticipated. "Don't talk to me unless you plan on. Well, unless you meet certain standards." I froze, rereading the message. The tone wasn't playful or flirtatious. It was brash, over the top, and left no room for conversation. I sat there, unsure whether to laugh or roll my eyes. I replied with something. What? I can't even remember now. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. She didn't respond, and I let it go, chalking it up to one of those bizarre online interactions everyone warns you about. A week passed, and the strange encounter faded from my mind. Life went on as usual, classes, work, and the occasional late-night fast food run. That night, my stomach growled after hours of cramming for an exam, so I decided to grab something quick. McDonald's seemed like the easiest option. The place was buzzing with its usual hum of activity, the fluorescent lights casting an odd glow over everything. I stepped into the line, placed my order, and shuffled to the counter to wait. My thoughts drifted, half focused on a class project due next week, when the employee behind the counter called my number. I stepped forward, not thinking much of it, but the moment she handed me my bag, the air shifted. Our eyes met, and time seemed to freeze. It was her, the girl from Tinder. Recognition flickered in her eyes first, and it was instant. Her expression shifted rapidly, a flash of disbelief followed by something closer to fear. She looked at me like I was the villain in some terrible drama, her hands visibly trembling as she held out my bag of food. For a split second, I was too stunned to react. Then the realization hit me like a wave. She thought I'd come here intentionally, that I'd tracked her down to confront her over that ridiculous message. The awkwardness in the air was suffocating, an invisible wall of tension that seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. I wanted to say something, to clear up the misunderstanding, but my brain refused to cooperate. What could I possibly say? Hey, I didn't know you worked here, and this is purely a coincidence. That sounded almost worse, like an excuse someone would give when caught red-handed. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to me, as if gauging the fastest escape route. I could feel the weight of her co-workers' curious glances, though none of them seemed to realize what was happening. My face burned with embarrassment. This wasn't just awkward, it was surreal. Finally, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the bag, muttered a quick, thanks, and walked out as fast as my legs would carry me. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with every step. I didn't look back, didn't dare risk seeing her reaction again. The cool night air hit me like a bomb as I stepped outside, but the tension in my chest didn't ease until I was halfway to my car. Sitting behind the wheel, I let out a shaky breath and shook my head, replaying the scene in my mind. What were the odds of something like this happening? It felt like the universe had decided to turn my life into some twisted comedy sketch. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of her face, wide-eyed, pale, filled with fear. She probably thought I was some kind of stalker, and the thought made me cringe. In reality, I barely remembered the interaction until now. The whole thing had been ridiculous from start to finish. A bizarre encounter that I wouldn't have believed if it hadn't happened to me. The next day, I deleted Tinder. Maybe I'd try again someday, but for now, I'd had enough of awkward dates and strange online encounters. Some lessons, I realized, don't need repeating. The theater was buzzing with excitement that night, the kind of electric energy that only comes from the premiere of a blockbuster movie. I'd been looking forward to this for weeks, a first date with someone who seemed genuinely interesting. Star Wars, The Force Awakens was the film, a perfect excuse for shared popcorn and whispered commentary during the action-packed scenes. At least, that's how I'd imagined it. What I didn't imagine was the surprise waiting for me when I arrived. She was standing by the ticket counter, but she wasn't alone. Beside her was another girl, grinning awkwardly. "This is my sister," my date said casually, as though it was the most natural thing in the world to bring a chaperone to a first date. I blinked, unsure how to respond. My gut told me something was off, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they were close, maybe it was last minute. Play it cool, I told myself. What's the worst that could happen? The worst started with the tickets. Somehow, I ended up pulling out my wallet and paying for all three of us. I can't even recall how it happened. It just did. Maybe it was her charm, or maybe it was the fact that old me couldn't handle confrontation. Either way, I found myself standing in line with a sinking feeling, clutching tickets for a movie I suddenly wasn't excited about anymore. As we settled into our seats, the situation only got worse. The lights dimmed, the iconic Star Wars crawl began, and I glanced over at them, eager to share in the moment. But they both looked utterly lost. "So who's that guy?" her sister whispered loudly, pointing at the screen. "Wait, what's the deal with the gold robot?" my date chimed in. It hit me then. They had never seen a Star Wars movie before. Not one. I stared ahead, trying to suppress my frustration as they whispered back and forth, their confusion breaking any chance of getting lost in the movie. Every twist, every reveal, every callback to the originals, none of it landed for them. Meanwhile, I sat there, acutely aware of how much I'd been looking forward to this moment, and how completely derailed it had become. When the credits finally rolled, I sighed in relief, ready to head home and call it a night. But no, the evening wasn't over yet. They wanted McDonald's. We piled into the fast food joint, the smell of fries and grease filling the air. I grabbed something small, a drink maybe, and watched as my date ordered fries. Just fries. Her sister ordered a full meal, of course. They sat across from me, chatting away like I wasn't even there. For over an hour, I sat in that fluorescent-lit purgatory, nursing my drink and watching her eat fries one at a time. Meanwhile, her sister took center stage, launching into an unfiltered tirade about everyone at her job. Co-workers, managers, even customers. No one was safe from her sharp, biting commentary. Every time I tried to shift the conversation, to steer it towards something even remotely date-like, she'd interrupt, dragging the focus back to her ongoing workplace drama. I glanced at my date more than once, hoping for some sign of acknowledgement, some spark of connection that might salvage the night. But she seemed content to let her sister dominate the conversation, occasionally nodding along or throwing in the odd comment. By the time I finally made it to my car, my head was spinning. What had just happened? Was this a date? A family outing? Some kind of elaborate prank? The whole experience felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into someone else's bizarre evening and been forced to play along. There was no second date, not even an attempt. She didn't reach out, and neither did I. To this day, I still think about that night from time to time, trying to make sense of it. Was it a test? A joke? Or just a glaring incompatibility that became painfully obvious over a tray of cold fries? I may not have gotten answers, but I walked away with one valuable lesson. If someone brings an unexpected guest to a first date, it's a red flag the size of a Star Destroyer. And next time, I'd be paying for only one ticket, mine. The air felt heavier than usual as I walked up the driveway, my heart pounding with the familiar mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with a first-time hookup. It had been a while since I'd let myself be this vulnerable, and I'd convinced myself this was going to be fun, casual, and maybe a bit thrilling. He'd seemed charming, funny even, and his messages hinted at a night I wouldn't regret. His place was small and a bit cluttered, but I didn't think much of it. We wasted no time, and before I knew it, we were tangled in a moment that was somehow both electric and slightly awkward. First-time encounters often are. Afterward, we lay there, the room falling into a quiet that felt too still. And that's when it happened. "So," he said, propping himself up on one elbow, his voice carrying a strange undertone I couldn't quite place. "You want to know what I'm really into?" I blinked, caught off guard. I forced a laugh, trying to keep the mood light. Sure. Why not?" Without warning, he reached down and grabbed my foot. My heart slammed against my ribs, and panic shot through me like ice water. I have an irrational fear, noophobia, of people touching my feet. It's the kind of thing that makes me freeze up or bolt, and in that moment, I chose the latter. I yanked my foot away, practically leaping off the bed. "I've got to go," I muttered, my voice trembling as I scrambled to find my clothes. My hands fumbled, but my legs moved instinctively, propelling me toward the exit before I could process what had just happened. I burst out of his room and into the dimly lit hallway, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My only focus was the door, the way out, the promise of fresh air that didn't feel suffocating. As I moved through the house, I noticed details I hadn't before: family photos lining the walls, mismatched furniture that spoke of years of use. I hadn't realized I wasn't in his place at all. I was in his parents' house. The living room came into view, and I nearly froze. Sitting on the couch, with a steaming cup of tea balanced on her knee, was a woman I knew well. Too well. It was my old therapist. Her eyes met mine, widening in shock, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. 100 memories flooded back, sessions spent unpacking my insecurities, her calm voice guiding me through emotional storms, the small but meaningful breakthroughs. And now, here I was, half-dressed and stumbling out of her son's bedroom. She looked at me, her expression a blend of disbelief and something that might have been concern. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. What could I even say? "Sorry, I didn't know this was your house. Also, I might have traumatized your son by running out of his room like it was on fire." Her son's voice broke the silence, calling from the hallway behind me. "Hey, you okay? Did I freak you out?" I didn't turn around. I couldn't. All I could do was nod stiffly at her, mutter something unintelligible under my breath, and make a beeline for the front door. My feet hit the pavement outside, the cool night air rushing over me like a slap. I didn't stop until I was a block away, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. It wasn't until I was safely back in my car, the engine humming softly, that the absurdity of the situation hit me. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the ceiling, and let out a laugh, hollow and disbelieving at first, then louder, uncontrollable. It was the kind of laugh that comes when there's nothing else you can do. I drove home in a daze, the events replaying in my mind like some surreal, dark comedy. The night had started with what I thought would be a simple hookup, a chance to step outside of my routine, and ended with me running out of a stranger's room, into the living room of my former therapist. Needless to say, there wasn't a second date. The dim glow of my phone's screen lit up my dorm room as I scrolled through Tinder late one night, bored out of my mind and half-heartedly swiping. It was a typical college evening, homework pushed to the side, social life creeping into the foreground. Then I saw her. She was older than me by a year or two, a junior or senior at the same university, with a smile that radiated confidence and an energy that felt magnetic even through her profile photos. A match came almost immediately, followed by her first message. Fast forward a few days, and I was at her apartment for our first hangout. The vibe was relaxed, nothing too intense, just Netflix and casual conversation. I thought she was amazing, down to earth, funny, and way out of my league. As I left that night, I found myself hoping this could turn into something real. When I told her I'd like to see her again, her reply was enthusiastic. "I'd love that. Just hit me up whenever." The week that followed was a flurry of texts and Snapchats. It felt exciting, like the kind of connection you don't stumble upon often. Then, out of the blue, she sent me a nude. I was startled, not because I didn't find her attractive, she was stunning, but because it was so unexpected. We hadn't crossed any lines during our first hangout. It had been completely platonic. Yet here she was, sending me pictures that left no room for ambiguity. I was a young guy, and this confident older girl was showing me attention I hadn't even asked for. I won't lie, I was flattered. And of course, I didn't object. The messages escalated over the week, and by the time we planned to meet again, I had no doubt where things were heading. That Saturday, she came over to my place. My roommates and I were lounging in the living room watching TV, and she seamlessly fit into the dynamic, laughing and chatting like she'd been part of the group for years. At one point, she leaned over and asked if she could stay the night. My brain went into overdrive. After everything she'd been sending me all week, I knew what she meant. Trying to be polite, I offered to sleep on the couch, but she shot that down quickly. "I'd rather you sleep in your bed with me," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was clear, this was happening. We retreated to my room, and one thing led to another. We hooked up, and afterward, we lay side by side in the hazy quiet that follows, the kind where you're not sure whether to break the silence or just let it linger. I'd tossed the used condom to the floor beside the bed, not thinking much of it in the moment. Then, out of nowhere, she got up abruptly. I watched as she walked around to my side of the bed and bent down to pick up the condom. My heart sank, confusion gripping me. Without saying a word, she darted into the bathroom and shut the door. A beat passed, then another. I stayed in bed, unsure of what to do. Then I heard a loud crash, followed by her voice muttering a panicked, "Oh no." Alarmed, I called out, "Are you okay?" No response. I hesitated for a moment before walking to the bathroom door. My mind raced with possibilities. Had she slipped? Hurt herself? But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I opened the door. She was standing in my shower, one leg propped up, trying to shove the condom into herself. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what she was doing, flipping the condom inside out and attempting to inseminate herself. I froze, my brain struggling to process the scene unfolding in front of me. Her head snapped toward me, eyes wide with shock. Time seemed to stand still for a second, then everything sped up. I shut the door as quickly as I'd opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. A moment later, she emerged, avoiding my gaze. "I'm gonna leave," she said quickly, grabbing her things. "Sounds good," I replied, my voice hollow. There was nothing else to say. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood there in stunned silence. My mind replayed the night over and over, searching for answers I'd never get. She never contacted me again, and I didn't reach out either. To this day, that night remains a surreal, unsettling memory, one that reminds me just how unpredictable people can be. The gamer bar was alive with the hum of arcade machines and the clatter of controllers, a place where neon lights bounced off walls plastered with pixelated murals. It was my kind of scene, nostalgic, geeky, and laid back. Tonight, it was also the setting for my first date with someone who seemed promising. We'd bonded over mutual nerdy interests and swapped witty banter through text messages, the kind of conversations that made me hopeful this might actually be different. When he walked in, he looked just like his profile photos, a little scruffy, glasses perched on his nose, and wearing a t-shirt with some obscure gaming reference that I immediately recognized. I waved, and he came over, smiling warmly. The moment he opened his mouth to greet me, however, my stomach dropped. He had no teeth. None. I struggled to mask my shock, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't something small or superficial. It was a glaring detail, one that had been carefully hidden during our chats and video calls. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. He probably had a good reason for it, right? Maybe an accident or a medical condition. I forced a smile and pushed the thought aside as we sat down. The conversation started smoothly enough. He was just as funny and smart as he'd seemed online, throwing out clever quips and sharing anecdotes about his favorite games. But soon he leaned in, lowering his voice as if he were about to share a secret. "So," he began, glancing around before continuing, "I don't know if you noticed." I blinked, trying not to look directly at his gums as he spoke. "Noticed what?" I asked, feigning ignorance. He gestured vaguely toward his face. "The teeth thing." It was impossible to ignore now. He launched into an explanation about a hack dentist who had convinced him all his teeth needed to be removed. Then came the horror story of budget constraints that prevented him from getting dentures, and the grim detail that he had to wait for bone shards to fall out of his gums before he could even consider replacements. I listened, nodding along sympathetically. It was a tragic story, and I genuinely felt bad for him. But as he spoke, it became clear that he was completely unfazed by the situation. He joked about it, brushing off any discomfort it might cause, both for himself and for me. And then the food arrived. As he talked, particles of his meal sprayed from his mouth, landing on the shared basket of fries between us. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but each fleck of food was a tiny jab at my appetite. It wasn't his fault, of course, he couldn't help it, but the visual was too much to ignore. I found myself retreating inward, my thoughts spiraling. If he'd hidden something this monumental from me, what else might he be keeping secret? Trust was the cornerstone of any relationship, and this omission felt like a crack in the foundation before we'd even started building anything. He, meanwhile, was oblivious to my growing discomfort, continuing to talk enthusiastically about his favorite games and the tabletop campaigns he'd been running. Normally, I'd have been thrilled to dive into those topics, but my focus kept shifting back to the reality of the situation. As the evening wore on, I realized something else. I couldn't get past the thought of intimacy with someone who had no teeth. I felt shallow for even thinking it, but the idea of kissing him made my stomach churn. I kept imagining the texture, the sensation, and it was enough to make me push my food away entirely. When the check came, I politely suggested we call it a night. He smiled, seemingly unaware of my internal struggle, and thanked me for such a fun time. I smiled back, hoping it didn't look forced, and we went our separate ways. On the drive home, I replayed the evening in my mind. It wasn't just the teeth, it was the way he'd hidden it, the way he assumed it wouldn't matter. Maybe it didn't to some people, but to me, it was a breach of trust one couldn't overlook. The next day, when he texted to ask about a second date, I let him down gently. He was a good guy, but I knew deep down that this wasn't something I could move past. Some things, no matter how trivial they might seem, are just too big to ignore. I had just joined Match.com, back when online dating was still a novelty and mostly populated by people desperate enough to take a chance on the unknown. I didn't have high hopes, but when her profile popped up, everything changed. She was stunning, out of my league stunning. The kind of beauty that made you double-check to see if it was some kind of catfish situation. But it wasn't. She responded to my message, and soon we were planning a date. When I met her in person, I felt like I was walking on air. She was even more gorgeous than her photos, all confidence and charm wrapped up in a perfectly tailored outfit. To my shock, the date was going well. Better than well. We were laughing, talking like we'd known each other forever, and by the time the first drinks were finished, we'd already stolen a kiss in the corner of the restaurant. I couldn't believe my luck. This kind of thing didn't happen to me. Not to me. So when she suggested we keep the night going and head to a bar nearby, I didn't hesitate. If anything, I was eager to stretch out the magic as long as possible. The bar was dimly lit, cozy, with a warm hum of conversation filling the air. We found a quiet corner, tucked away from the crowd, and settled in with our drinks. She leaned in close, her hand brushing mine, her laugh lighting up the room. I couldn't stop marveling at the surreal turn my night had taken. And then the door opened. A group of young African men walked in, laughing and talking among themselves. It was unusual, I'll admit. Our town was small and predominantly white, the kind of place where seeing people of different ethnicities stood out more than it should have. But it was no big deal, or at least it shouldn't have been. That's when she stood up. At first, I thought maybe she was going to the restroom or getting another drink. But instead, she turned toward the group and began shouting. Loudly. "You don't belong here," she yelled, her voice cutting through the chatter in the bar like a knife. "Go back to where you came from." The words hit me like a freight train, and the air seemed to leave the room. She wasn't done. She kept going, dropping slurs, including that word, over and over. The group of men froze, exchanging incredulous looks, their laughter replaced with stunned silence. The entire bar turned to watch the scene unfold, a mixture of disbelief and unease rippling through the crowd. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, the kind where the camera zooms in on the protagonist's horrified face while the world around them spins into chaos. My mind raced, every cell in my body screaming, "What is happening right now?" I stared at her, my chest tightening with a sickening realization. This person, this gorgeous, seemingly perfect person, was nothing like the woman I thought I'd spent the evening with. My skin crawled as the shock melted into shame, embarrassment, and anger. I couldn't sit there a second longer. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked straight out the door without looking back. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did little to cool the fire of emotions raging inside me. She didn't follow me. At least, not immediately. The next day, my phone buzzed with a message from her. She wanted to meet up again. Another date. Like nothing had happened. I didn't reply. There was no explanation she could offer, no excuse I could stomach. Some things you just can't unsee, and her actions were one of them. Too good to be true. That's what the whole night had been. A cruel, twisted reminder that appearances don't mean a thing when the person behind them is rotten to the core. For days, I replayed the night in my head, wondering how I could have missed the signs, if there even were any. But the truth was, I hadn't missed anything. She'd hidden it well, the way people often do with their worst traits, until the right moment brought it to the surface. She'd seemed like a great match on Tinder. Smart, edgy, with a sense of humor that bordered on irreverent but never crossed into outright bizarre. At least, that's what I thought. She walked in, dressed to impress, exuding confidence. I stood up to greet her, trying to hide my nervous energy. From the outset, she seemed exactly as I'd imagined. Funny, engaging, and full of sharp wit. Over appetizers, we talked about everything from school to movies to our shared love of obscure music. It felt easy, natural, until it didn't. The shift came gradually, subtle at first. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, and asked if I'd ever had a truly wild relationship. I laughed awkwardly, unsure of what she meant, and said something vague about not being the adventurous type. That's when the conversation took a turn I hadn't seen coming. "You know," she began, stirring her drink absently, "I've been thinking a lot about my ex-husband lately." The mention of an ex wasn't unusual. Everyone has a past, but the way she said it made my skin prickle. "Oh," I said cautiously, unsure of where this was going. She smiled, a strange glint in her eye. "I was thinking, if we hook up tonight, maybe we could record it, for fun. And then I could send it to him." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. I froze, unsure if I'd misheard her. "You'd send it to your ex?" I asked, my voice faltering. "Yeah," she said, completely nonchalant. "He'd lose his mind. It'd be hilarious." I forced a laugh, trying to mask my discomfort, but my mind was already spinning. This wasn't just a red flag, it was an entire parade of them. I reached for my water, stalling for time, trying to decide if I should cut the date short right then and there. But before I could think of an excuse to leave, she took the conversation to an even darker place. "You know what I really enjoy?" she asked, her tone suddenly serious. I looked up, hesitant to answer. "What's that?" "I like being hit," she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing a favorite hobby. "And my favorite kind of sex is safe word rape." I didn't even know how to respond. My brain stalled, caught between disbelief and an overwhelming urge to get as far away as possible. She smiled as if she'd just shared a fun little secret, completely oblivious to the wave of unease washing over me. I set my fork down, my appetite gone. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming at full volume. This wasn't a casual quirk or a harmless eccentricity. This was something far darker, something I couldn't begin to untangle. I don't think I'm really your type," I managed to say, my voice shaking slightly. "Maybe we should call it a night." Her expression barely faltered. She shrugged, as if she'd expected this reaction, and went back to sipping her drink. "Suit yourself," she said, completely unfazed. I signaled for the check, paid for the meal without looking at her, and left the restaurant as quickly as I could without outright sprinting. The cool night air hit me like a wave, but it did little to calm my racing heart. I walked back to my car in a daze, replaying the conversation in my mind, each word more surreal than the last. When I got home, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone. Tinder was still open, her profile staring back at me, a stark reminder of how far off the rails things had gone. Without hesitation, I deleted the app, erasing it from my phone like I was scrubbing away the memory of the night. That date wasn't just a bad experience, it was a wake-up call. I'd gone looking for connection, something light and fun to break the monotony of college life. Instead, I'd found a dark corner of the dating world I hadn't been prepared for. Some people's stories aren't meant to intertwine, and hers was one I was more than happy to leave behind. The first time my mom told me she was joining Tinder, I nearly spit out my coffee. It wasn't that I was against it. In fact, I was all for her stepping into a new chapter after enduring decades of an unhappy marriage. It was just unexpected. Stella's getting her groove back, she declared with a smirk, echoing the title of that old movie. And I, as her adult child, was 100% on her team. If anyone deserved a little adventure, it was her. From the start, she made it clear, this wasn't about finding a long-term relationship. No romance, no strings, just a bit of fun while she was on a work trip out of state. It sounded harmless enough. She started sending me screenshots of potential matches, asking for my opinions. It was surreal, sitting in my tiny college apartment, playing wingman to my own mom. Not this guy, I'd text back. His bio screams midlife crisis. Or, swipe left. He's holding a fish. You hate fishing. And then she found him. The guy. Her pick for the night. The moment I saw his profile, alarm bells went off. His photos were normal enough, but his bio read like a walking, talking red flag. He seemed too smooth, too eager. The kind of guy who could charm anyone into letting their guard down. Mom, I texted, this guy is sketchy. Hard pass. But she laughed it off. Oh, come on. He's just cute and chatty. What's the worst that could happen? She was an adult. I couldn't stop her. So, with some last-minute safety reminders from me, share your location. Tell me when you're back at the hotel. She went off to meet him. The next morning, I got the text. Well, that was interesting. She didn't elaborate, just said they'd hung out for a few hours, and he'd dropped her off. Nothing serious, she added, which I took as her way of saying it was over. Or so I thought. Later that afternoon, she called me, her voice shaking. He knows my address. I froze. What? How? Apparently, during their brief time together, he'd pieced together enough details about her life, her work, the city she'd flown from, and the general timeline of her trip, to figure out which flight she was taking the next day. From there, he'd tracked down her final destination. Using public tax records, he'd found her full name, which led him to her Facebook profile. It didn't stop there. He called your dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My stomach dropped. My parents hadn't spoken directly since the divorce. For this stranger to insert himself into their lives, calling my dad and spilling details about my mom's Tinder rendezvous, was beyond invasive. My mom sounded utterly rattled as she recounted the messages he'd sent her afterward, swinging wildly between professions of love and accusations of betrayal. He sent him pictures, she continued, and screenshots of our texts. Everything. I was furious, both for her and for myself. This wasn't just about my mom anymore. This man had disrupted our family in the most grotesque way possible. You need to call the police, I told her. She hesitated, not wanting to escalate things, but I insisted. This wasn't something to brush off. The harassment didn't stop. Over the next few days, he sent her a barrage of messages, alternating between declaring undying love and berating her for being untrustworthy. He demanded explanations, claiming he couldn't trust her even though she'd done nothing wrong. My mom blocked him on everything, Tinder, Facebook, her phone, but he found ways around it, creating new accounts to send her messages. Eventually, she did go to the police. They took her seriously, thankfully, and started the process of filing a restraining order. But the experience left her shaken to her core. For weeks, she couldn't relax, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if he'd show up unannounced. When the dust finally settled, she deleted Tinder and vowed never to touch dating apps again. For me, the whole ordeal was a sobering reminder of how quickly something harmless can spiral into something dangerous. I'd supported her decision to put herself out there, and I still do, but none of us could have predicted how unhinged someone could become after just a few hours of interaction. My nerves were doing their usual predate dance at the bar, but the moment he walked in, my doubts evaporated. He was tall, effortlessly handsome, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made heads turn. He spotted me immediately, flashing a smile that could have melted glaciers, and I thought, wow, this is actually happening. The conversation flowed like water. He was charming, witty, and somehow made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. I kept catching myself thinking, how is this guy single? Better yet, why is he interested in me? It felt too good to be true, and I started wondering if maybe, just this once, I'd lucked out. The drinks turned into more drinks, and before long, the chemistry between us had us heading back to his place. His apartment was clean and well decorated, the kind of place that suggested he had his life together. I was impressed, and as he pulled me into a kiss, I thought, this night might just be perfect. Things escalated quickly. We were making out, his hands roaming, my heart pounding in anticipation. The heat between us was palpable. As we moved to his bedroom, my excitement grew. He seemed like the full package, funny, charming, and now passionate. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. As I pulled his pants down, I was met with surprise. There, staring back at me, was something I hadn't mentally prepared for, a micro-penis. It was maybe 2 inches long, barely the size of my finger. For a second, I froze, unsure how to react. I wasn't one to judge. Everyone's body is different, but I couldn't deny the jolt of confusion that ran through me. Okay, I told myself, let's see where this goes. I started to gently touch him, my mind racing. How are we going to have sex? I wondered. Then optimistically I thought maybe he's got other skills. Maybe he's a master at oral, and this is going to be one of those surprising, unforgettable nights. But nope. As I began to pivot the moment towards something else, he stopped me, clearly uninterested in anything except the main event. I'm not really into that, he said, brushing off the idea of foreplay with a confidence I didn't quite understand. He wanted to skip everything and go straight to penetration. I nodded, still trying to salvage the night, but doubts were beginning to creep in. He guided me to lie on my stomach and positioned himself behind me. The room was quiet except for the sound of his breathing as he began. But almost immediately, it was clear something wasn't quite right. I could feel him moving, thrusting with enthusiasm, but there was no actual penetration happening. Instead, he was sliding between my thighs. I froze, trying to figure out what to do. Should I say something? Correct him? But before I could decide, he began to talk. You like that? He asked, his voice low. My lips twitched, and I bit down hard to stifle the laugh bubbling in my throat. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much. He kept going, his dirty talk growing more explicit and confident. Meanwhile, I lay there, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming urge to laugh at the sheer absurdity of the scene. It didn't take long for him to finish, grunting with satisfaction as he collapsed beside me. I stared at the ceiling, my mind blank, trying to process what had just happened. He looked so pleased with himself, completely oblivious to the fact that he hadn't actually penetrated me at all. After a few moments of awkward silence, I mumbled something about needing to go home. He didn't protest, just smiled lazily and said he'd love to see me again. I smiled back weakly, grabbed my things, and left as quickly as I could without making it obvious. The walk back to my car was surreal. My mind replayed the events over and over, each detail more ridiculous than the last. I couldn't help but laugh once I was safely inside the car, the kind of laugh that comes from pure disbelief. That night taught me something about the unpredictable nature of dating. Sometimes, the most promising starts can lead to the strangest endings. But hey, at least it's a story. The sushi restaurant was packed, the kind of night that felt like a blur of clattering dishes, endless orders, and barely contained chaos. I darted between tables, balancing trays of sashimi and miso soup, trying to keep up with the relentless dinner rush. Among the sea of customers, one table stood out, 2 guys, one of them particularly striking. He had a confident, easy smile and tattoos that crept out from under his sleeves, hinting at stories I'd never hear. Despite the chaos, I made sure they had great service. At the end of their meal, they left a tip so generous it stopped me in my tracks. Later that night, after finally collapsing on my couch, beer in hand, I opened Tinder to mindlessly swipe and decompress. And there he was, the same guy from the restaurant, unmistakable with his sharp features and distinctive ink. My heart skipped a beat. The tip had been memorable, but this? What were the odds? I swiped right and passed out, too tired to overthink it. The next morning, I woke up to a match and a sweet message waiting for me. We started texting, and he was charming, almost disarmingly so. He mentioned he was only in town for business, which should have been my first red flag. But I was intrigued, and he asked me out to dinner at a high-end French restaurant that I could never afford on my own. I hesitated, unsure if I should go. My roommates, fueled by mimosas and bad advice, encouraged me. What's the harm in a nice dinner? They said. By that evening, I'd agreed, but things were already off. He insisted on picking me up, pressing harder than anyone should for a first date. My instincts flared, and I told him flat out that I'd cancel if I couldn't drive myself. He backed off, and we arranged to meet at the restaurant. The place was stunning, the kind of place where the lighting is dim, the wine list is longer than a novel, and everyone speaks in hushed tones. He was already seated when I arrived, looking sharp and relaxed. The dinner started well enough. He ordered a $200 bottle of wine, lobster, appetizers, and desserts, sparing no expense. By the time the bill came, I was sure the meal had totaled somewhere close to $600. I couldn't believe someone would spend that kind of money on a first date. As the evening went on, though, the facade started to crack. The more he drank, the more he let slip. Midway through the meal, he casually admitted he was married, but claimed it was an open relationship. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. In response, he pulled out his phone, called his wife, and even sent her a picture of me. To my shock, she sounded excited. "She's gorgeous," I heard her say, her voice tinny over the speaker. "Invite her to Cancun. We'd love to meet her." My stomach churned. He hung up, grinning, and explained that his wife was bisexual and into women. He suggested I join them for a weekend getaway. Red flags piled up faster than I could process. I tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, asking about his work. Without blinking, he told me he was involved with a drug cartel. He spoke about it casually, as if it were just another day at the office. He assured me it was perfectly safe, but my chest tightened. This wasn't the kind of conversation you had on a casual date, or ever. I told him I needed to leave. He followed me out, trailing me to my car, still trying to sell me on the idea of joining him and his wife. He pulled up photos of her on his phone. She was undeniably beautiful, and scrolled through his Instagram, showing off their lavish life in Cancun. "You can trust me," he insisted. "This could be fun." When I still refused, his tone shifted. "I spent all this money on dinner," he said, his voice hardening. "The least you could do is come back to my hotel room." When I backed away, he tried to grab my hand, leaning in for a kiss I wanted no part of. My pulse was pounding as I twisted free and bolted to my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and sped away, checking the rearview mirror constantly. I was terrified he'd follow me home, so I drove aimlessly for an hour before calling a friend. I spent the night at her place, grateful she had male roommates who could make me feel safe. The next morning, I deleted Tinder without hesitation. The more I replayed the night, the darker it felt. Was he just an unhinged rich guy? Or was there something more sinister? Human trafficking, perhaps? I'll never know for sure, but I'm haunted by the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. It was a lesson I'll never forget. Trust your gut, and when the red flags start piling up, don't wait to see how the story ends. My friend, a fellow soldier and someone I'd always known to be tough as nails, leaned forward as we shared stories about strange encounters during a rare night off duty. But when it was her turn, her voice dropped, her expression darkened, and I knew this wasn't just another funny or awkward tale. "This one's different," she started, her tone serious. "It still gets to me, you know?" I nodded, bracing myself. She told me about how it began, a typical modern romance story, or so it seemed. She had been talking to a guy she'd met online, and everything had felt surprisingly normal. He was charming, friendly, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. After a few days of casual conversation, he suggested meeting up for drinks. No red flags, no warning signs, just a simple, seemingly innocent invitation. So she agreed. The bar was a cozy spot, tucked away in one of Norway's quieter neighborhoods. When she arrived, he was already there, smiling and waving her over like an old friend. The first round of drinks came and went, and the conversation flowed easily enough at first. He asked about her life in the military, her travels, and her interests. She started to relax, thinking this might actually turn into a good night. But then the questions began to shift. At first, it was subtle, questions that felt slightly deeper than typical first date fare. "What's the worst memory you have from childhood?" he asked, his eyes locked onto hers in an almost unnerving way. She brushed it off, giving a vague answer and steering the conversation elsewhere. But he didn't let up. "What's your first memory of anything? Intimate?" he asked next, his voice casual, but the question landed like a stone in her stomach. She laughed nervously, trying to dodge the question, but his persistence was unsettling. Every other topic seemed to circle back to something unnervingly personal, even dark. Still, he managed to maintain a facade of charm, keeping her from bolting out the door. When the drinks were finished, he suggested they continue the night at his place. She hesitated, but he seemed harmless enough, a little odd, sure, but not threatening. She agreed. His apartment was small but clean, almost sterile. Too sterile, she thought, but she pushed the thought aside. She excused herself to the bathroom, needing a moment to regroup and shake off the nagging unease creeping up her spine. As she washed her hands, she heard faint noises coming from another room. Curious, and now slightly on edge, she cracked the bathroom door open, careful not to make a sound. She followed the noise to a partially open door down the hall. Inside, she saw him moving around, his back to her. He was spreading thick sheets of plastic over the floor and walls, carefully smoothing out the edges as if preparing for something. The hair on her neck stood up. Her breath hitched, and her mind raced. This wasn't normal. This wasn't safe. She stepped back, careful not to make a sound, and quickly returned to the bathroom. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and panicked. She had to get out. Forcing herself to stay calm, she emerged from the bathroom, putting on her best casual smile. "Hey, I just remembered I've got an early shift tomorrow," she said, grabbing her bag and heading toward the door without waiting for a response. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but didn't try to stop her. She left as quickly as she could without breaking into a run. The moment she was safely outside, she called the police. She didn't expect much to come of it. Maybe they'd check in on him, maybe not. But to her surprise, her call set off a series of events that confirmed her worst fears. The man was already under surveillance for suspicious behavior, and her report gave them the probable cause they needed to search his apartment. What they found turned her stomach. The plastic wasn't for a home renovation project. It was preparation for something far more sinister. Tools, restraints, and other evidence suggested he was on the brink of committing something unthinkable. "I still think about what could have happened if I'd stayed," she told me, her voice heavy with lingering fear. "How close I came to being. I don't even know. Another statistic, maybe." Her story left me cold. It was a chilling reminder of how easily something that feels normal can take a turn into something dark. She's tough, no doubt about it, but even she admitted that night left scars she might never fully shake. The first time I saw her photo on Tinder, I was struck by her smile, bright, confident, and framed by golden blonde hair. Her profile was charming, filled with witty comments and quirky hobbies. She was fluent in German, she mentioned, though it seemed like a throwaway detail at the time. We matched quickly, and our conversations flowed effortlessly. She was funny, engaging, and best of all, seemed genuinely interested in me. Our first date is a blur now, but I remember walking away feeling like I'd hit the jackpot. We met up a few more times after that, each encounter reinforcing how much we clicked. Eventually, I found myself at her place, a cozy apartment filled with books, plants, and an inexplicable collection of miniature figurines. That night, things escalated naturally, and we ended up in her bed. At first, everything was perfect. She was beautiful, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. But somewhere in the heat of the moment, she started shouting in German. It was loud, passionate, and utterly unexpected. I froze for a split second, my mind scrambling to process the sudden switch to a language I couldn't understand. No offense to German speakers, but it's not exactly a language that screams romance. It's more like a drill sergeant barking commands. Her words rolled out in sharp, guttural bursts, and I was equal parts fascinated and terrified. I had no idea what she was saying. Was she complimenting me? Giving instructions? Cursing me out? The sheer unpredictability of it threw me off my rhythm completely. Still, I powered through, convincing myself this was just one of her quirks. It wasn't a deal breaker, just a surprise. A week later, we decided to grab drinks at a local bar she suggested. It was one of those laid-back spots with dim lighting and an impressive collection of craft beers. When we walked in, she greeted the bartender with a familiarity that made me pause. They laughed, exchanged a few words, and he even asked how she'd been. Curious, I asked her how she knew him once he'd stepped away. She smiled casually and said, "Oh, that's my ex-husband." I nearly choked on my drink. "Ex-husband?" I repeated, trying to process what I'd just heard. We were both in our 20s. How did someone our age already have an ex-husband? "Yeah," she said nonchalantly. "We were married for about 2 years. It's cool, though. We're still friends." She shrugged it off like it was no big deal, but my mind was reeling. I looked back at the bartender, who was casually wiping down glasses, as if this was the most normal situation in the world. Before I could ask anything else, she excused herself to use the bathroom. The moment she disappeared, the bartender leaned over the counter with a sly grin. "So," he said, his tone dripping with amusement, "how are you liking the German in bed?" I blinked, stunned into silence. Of all the things he could have said, that was the last one I expected. Still caught off guard, I stammered, "It's all right." He winked at me. Before I could gather my thoughts, she returned, sliding into her seat beside me as if nothing had happened. The bartender didn't miss a beat, acting like the brief exchange between us had never occurred. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the whole situation left me with an odd feeling I couldn't shake. She was great, fun, attractive, and smart, but there was something about her unpredictability that made me hesitate. The German outbursts, the casual mention of an ex-husband who happened to be serving us drinks. It was all just a bit much. We hung out a few more times before things fizzled out naturally. There wasn't any dramatic ending, just a quiet realization that we weren't quite the right fit for each other. I still go to that bar occasionally, and every time I do, the bartender greets me with a knowing smile. He always comps my first drink, which I like to think of as a silent acknowledgement of the bizarre shared experience. The first time I met him, he seemed confident, charming even. He had that air of someone who knows exactly what they want, a quality that, in the right amount, can be magnetic. He planned our first date without much input from me, choosing the restaurant, the time, even the route we took to get there. It felt a little controlling, but I brushed it off. Maybe he's just trying to be chivalrous, I told myself. Some people like to take charge, and maybe he thought I'd appreciate it. That night went fine enough, though something about him kept me slightly on edge. He was polite, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in me, but there was a tension simmering beneath the surface. Little comments he made, subtle digs at how I held my fork or the way I laughed, pricked at me like tiny needles. I ignored them, chalking it up to first date awkwardness. When he asked for a second date, I hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed. He suggested we go to London for the evening, saying he'd handle all the details. The vagueness immediately set off alarms in my mind. I tried to be casual about it, asking where in London we were going and what he had planned, but he dodged the question. "It's a surprise," he said with a smug grin, like that would put me at ease. I pressed further, explaining that I needed to know at least a little about where we were going, mostly for safety, though I didn't say that outright. "I just need to know what to wear," I lied, hoping that would prompt him to share more. His response was strange. "Wear a dress," he said flatly, as though it were in order. I felt my stomach twist. I never wear dresses, they're not my style, and I wasn't about to start now just because someone else told me to. "I don't really do dresses," I replied lightly, trying to keep the mood from souring. "I'll just wear something comfortable." His reaction was immediate and sharp. His tone, which had been playful before, hardened. "Why do you have to be so difficult?" he snapped. "Can't you just go along with it for once?" For once? We'd only met once. I felt my chest tighten. Something about the way he spoke sent a chill down my spine. "I don't think I'm being difficult," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I just want to know where we're going. It's not too much to ask." That's when he lost it. His words spilled out like venom, his face twisting with anger. "You're such a stuck-up bitch," he spat, his voice shaking with frustration. "Always playing games. You're nothing but a cock tease." I froze, my heart pounding as his words sank in. The anger in his voice was startling, the kind that makes your instincts scream at you to get away as fast as possible. This wasn't someone who'd read me wrong or misunderstood my boundaries. This was someone who didn't think they mattered at all. "I don't think this is going to work," I said quietly, already reaching for my phone. "You're out of order," he barked, but I wasn't listening anymore. My hands shook as I opened the app and blocked him. His messages disappeared instantly, replaced by an eerie silence that hung over me for the rest of the night. It wasn't until later, sitting alone in my room, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. I'd felt uneasy around him from the beginning, but I'd ignored those feelings, convincing myself that I was overreacting. Now, I realized just how close I'd come to something far worse than an uncomfortable date. The next day, I deleted his number and told a few close friends what had happened, partly for my own safety and partly as a reminder to myself that I wasn't being difficult. I was setting boundaries, something he clearly couldn't handle. That experience stayed with me, not because of how it ended, but because of what it taught me. Trusting your instincts isn't just important, it's necessary. And anyone who makes you feel like you're being too much for wanting to feel safe isn't someone worth your time. In hindsight, the red flags had been there all along. I just needed to learn how to see them. I was sitting across from him, a man I'd matched with on Match.com who seemed decent enough online. His profile had been straightforward, his messages polite, and I figured I'd give it a shot. But from the moment we sat down, something felt off. It wasn't the kind of unease that screamed danger, more like a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite put my finger on. He chewed gum constantly, even as he greeted me. Not just chewing, but snapping it loudly between his teeth. It was a minor annoyance, but I brushed it off. Everyone has quirks, right? The conversation started fine. Small talk, a few jokes, nothing groundbreaking. But as the night went on, his comments grew increasingly strange. I'd always been honest in my profile about being a UK size 14 to 16, confident in who I was, and unapologetic about my curves. At one point, I made a light-hearted joke about my fat arse, something I often did to disarm potential awkwardness. Without missing a beat, he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Yes, I noticed." His tone was flat, devoid of humor or charm, and his words landed like a slap. I laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Was it an insult? An observation? A clumsy attempt at a joke? Whatever it was, it felt unnecessarily rude. The silence that followed hung in the air like a bad smell, and I suddenly found myself counting the minutes until the date was over. Then there was the gum. He'd been chewing it the entire time, which was bad enough, but when our meals arrived, he casually plucked it from his mouth and stuck it onto the side plate meant for bread. My stomach churned as I watched him leave it there, clearly intending for the waitress to deal with it. It wasn't just gross, it was disrespectful. I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, determined to salvage what was left of the evening. But it was like trying to start a fire in the rain. He answered my questions with disinterested shrugs or one-word replies, making no effort to keep the dialogue alive. I felt like I was interviewing him for a job he didn't want. The final nail in the coffin came when we bumped into one of my colleagues. She was tipsy and cheerful, clearly enjoying her night out, and she stumbled over to say hello. "Fabergig is the best boss ever," she slurred, throwing her arms around me in an overly enthusiastic hug. I laughed, brushing it off with a wave of my hand. "I'm really not," I said, trying to downplay her drunken praise. But when I glanced back at my date, his reaction made my stomach sink. He didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he turned his back to her completely, like she wasn't worth his time. The blatant rudeness of it left me speechless. My colleague, oblivious to the slight, eventually wandered off, but I was done. "I think I'm going to call it a night," I said, forcing a polite smile as I reached for my bag. He didn't argue or ask why. Instead, as I turned to leave, he made one final move that turned the evening from disappointing to outright bizarre. He leaned toward me as if to say goodbye, but instead attempted to shoulder bump me, a move that seemed both petty and unnecessarily aggressive. He missed, the motion clumsy and awkward, and I was too stunned to react. I didn't look back as I walked out the door. The moment I got home, I blocked him on Match.com and reported him for his behavior. I wasn't sure if it would make a difference, but it felt like the least I could do. I couldn't believe I'd wasted an evening on someone so lacking in basic decency. Looking back, it wasn't just his comments or his behavior that bothered me. It was the way he seemed to revel in being inconsiderate, as though he found power in making others uncomfortable. It was a stark reminder that, no matter how polished someone seems online, you can't truly know who they are until you meet them in person. The next day, I deleted our messages, erasing any trace of him from my phone. The date was a disaster, but it left me with a clear resolution. Never ignore your instincts, especially when someone shows you who they really are. I'd agreed to meet her here, at a Starbucks, for our first date. It felt casual, low stakes, a safe way to see if there was a spark. Her profile had been intriguing, funny, intelligent, passionate about animal rights. I wasn't vegan, but she'd assured me she was fine with that. The door chimed as she walked in, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail and a brightly colored tote bag slung over her shoulder. She smiled, and for a moment, I felt my nerves settle. She was just as pretty as her photos, and I thought, this could actually go well. We exchanged pleasantries and joined the line. As we waited, she casually mentioned her veganism again, saying it was more than just a diet. It was her way of life. I nodded, listening, and reassured her that I respected her choices. She seemed satisfied with that and smiled, her demeanor calm and confident. When it was my turn to order, I asked for my usual, a coffee with cream. The moment the words left my mouth, the air around us shifted. She froze, her smile vanishing. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a second, I thought I'd misspoken. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo through the entire cafe, she shouted, "You're a cow murderer." Every head in the room turned toward us. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, cups clattered onto saucers, and the baristas paused in their movements, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. My face flushed hot as her words registered. She wasn't joking, she was furious. "You're contributing to the torture and slaughter of innocent animals," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "Do you even know what they go through? You're complicit in their suffering." I stood there, stunned, my mind racing to catch up. This wasn't just a passionate outburst, it was a full-blown scene, and I was at the center of it. People were staring, some whispering, others outright gawking. I tried to stammer out a response, something to defuse the situation, but my words caught in my throat. The barista behind the counter glanced at me nervously, unsure whether to hand over my drink or wait for the storm to pass. "Look," I finally managed, my voice low, "I respect your choices, but this isn't the time or place for this." She didn't hear me, or maybe she didn't care. She was too busy listing the horrors of the dairy industry, her voice trembling with emotion. I could feel my chest tightening, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on me. I hadn't come here to debate ethics or become the target of a public shaming. I'd come for coffee and a conversation. I glanced at the exit, calculating the quickest way out of this situation. My drink was finally placed on the counter, but I didn't even reach for it. Instead, I pulled out my wallet, handed over the cash to pay for both our orders, and said, "I think I'll leave." Her expression flickered for a moment, shock, maybe even regret, but she didn't stop me. I grabbed my receipt and headed for the door, the whispers of the other patrons following me like a shadow. The cool air outside hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. As I walked to my car, I replayed the scene in my mind, each detail sharpening with every step. Her anger, the way she'd weaponized the moment to make a public point, the looks on the faces of strangers, all of it felt surreal. I'd expected differences in opinion, maybe even a light-hearted debate, but not this. When I got home, I blocked her number and deleted our chats. I wasn't angry, not exactly, more bewildered than anything. It was clear we were on entirely different wavelengths, and any chance of a second date had been obliterated in that Starbucks. Later, I told my friends about it, and they laughed, calling it a classic Tinder horror story. But for me, it was more than just an awkward encounter. It was a reminder that some people's passion, no matter how admirable, can blind them to the line between conviction and respect. And as much as I admired her dedication, I knew I needed something simpler, someone who could let me drink my coffee in peace. The sun was setting as we strolled along the trail, the sky painted with hues of gold and lavender. Every word she spoke felt like it had weight, yet her laughter was light enough to make my heart lift. From the moment I met her, I was convinced she was it, the one. We walked for hours, lost in conversation, our steps falling in sync as if we'd done this 1,000 times before. She was smart, kind, and stunningly beautiful in a way that made you forget what you were saying mid-sentence. We had planned to head to the beach after our walk, but as luck would have it, the skies darkened and rain started to fall. I suggested heading somewhere else, maybe grabbing a coffee or finding a cozy spot indoors, but she surprised me. "Your mom lives nearby, right?" she asked, her smile disarming. "I'd love to meet her." I hesitated. Meeting my mom on the first date? That wasn't in the playbook, but she was so sincere, so at ease, that I found myself agreeing. "All right," I said, trying to mask my nerves. To my surprise, it wasn't awkward at all. My mom took to her immediately, and she fit right in, joining the conversation as if she'd been part of the family for years. We shared dinner, laughing and swapping stories, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected, hope. Afterward, my mom went upstairs to grab something, and she excused herself to the bathroom. As I was heading back down the landing, she appeared, her eyes catching mine in the dim light. Without hesitation, she reached out, her fingers brushing mine before she leaned in and kissed me. It was soft and sweet, yet it left me reeling. I couldn't believe how perfect everything felt. The next time we met, it was at my place. We talked for hours before the night turned intimate. It was effortless, like we had always been meant to find each other. Everything about her felt right. When I told her I had to go away for work for a month, she didn't flinch. I understand, she said, her voice steady and supportive. It's your job, and I know how much you love it. I'll be here when you get back. Her understanding only deepened my feelings for her. When I returned, everything picked up right where we'd left off. She greeted me with the same warmth, the same spark, as if no time had passed at all. A month later, we decided to go on holiday together. A week of sun, sea, and everything that felt like love. It was perfect. Every day felt like a dream, and as we shared quiet moments on the beach or laughed over dinner, I thought, this is it. This is the person I want to spend my life with. The holiday ended too soon. On the train ride back from the airport, we sat close, stealing kisses and whispering plans for the future. Her stop came first, and as she got off, she turned back for one last hug, her hand lingering on mine. I'll see you soon, she said, her smile as bright as ever. But that was the last time I saw her. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. I texted her later that week, and her reply was brief. I just need some space. I told her I understood, gave her time, and waited. I had to go away for work again, and when I came back, I reached out. Want to grab lunch? I asked, hopeful. Her reply shattered me. I'm over it, she said. I've moved on. I couldn't believe it. Everything had been perfect. Or at least, I thought it had been. We'd laughed, shared dreams, created memories that I replayed in my mind like scenes from a movie. How had it all unraveled so quickly? What had I done wrong? For weeks, I replayed every conversation, every moment, searching for answers. Was it something I'd said? Something I hadn't done? The silence left by her absence was deafening, and no matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. The pub was lively that evening, buzzing with chatter and laughter, the kind of place that felt like a safe choice for a last-minute Tinder date. I wasn't expecting much, just a drink and a chance to see if there was a connection. When I arrived, I spotted him right away, sitting at a table near the back. But something was immediately off. As I approached, I noticed a gash on his forehead, fresh, gooey, and alarmingly out of place. It wasn't a small cut you could ignore. It looked recent and serious enough to demand an explanation. My stomach tightened as I slid into the chair across from him. Hey, I said cautiously, gesturing to his forehead. What happened? Are you okay? He blinked at me, looking genuinely confused. What do you mean? He asked, tilting his head like I'd just mentioned something absurd. I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile or offer an explanation, but he didn't. He seemed completely oblivious to the fact that there was a gaping wound on his face. My unease grew, but I decided not to push. Maybe he didn't want to talk about it, or maybe this was just one of those quirks you encountered in online dating. Still, the air between us felt heavier than it should have for a first meeting. We ordered drinks, and as the conversation began, the tension only deepened. He wasted no time diving into the story of his last relationship. I just got out of something pretty serious, he started, swirling his drink with a distracted air. Yeah, I asked, trying to sound polite, but already feeling wary. He nodded. It was with an older woman. We were together for about a year. That wasn't unusual, but his tone hinted at something darker. What happened? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He hesitated, then leaned in as if sharing a scandalous secret. She slept with her son's best friend, he said flatly. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I blinked, unsure I'd heard him correctly. Her son's best friend? I repeated, my voice trailing off. Yeah, he said, taking a sip of his drink. The kid was 15. My stomach turned. I felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me. So, you were dating someone who... He cut me off with a shrug, as if brushing away the weight of what he'd just admitted. Yeah, I guess you could say she had some issues. Some issues? The words escaped before I could stop them. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. He'd just casually admitted to being in a relationship with someone who had committed a heinous act, and he didn't seem the least bit fazed by it. I glanced at the wound on his forehead again, the uneasiness in my chest growing heavier. The fact that he didn't acknowledge it, didn't even seem to realize it was there, made the whole situation feel surreal, like I was trapped in a scene from a movie that didn't make sense. Look, I said finally, my voice calm but firm. It seems like you've got a lot going on right now. I don't think this is a good idea. He frowned, but before he could respond, I reached into my bag, pulled out a 5-pound note, and set it on the table. For my drink, I said, standing up. I didn't wait for him to argue or try to stop me. I grabbed my coat and left, the cool night air hitting me like a wave of relief. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were racing. Who was this guy? Why hadn't he been more disturbed by his ex's actions? And what in the world had happened to his forehead? Even now, I still wonder about him. Did he ever figure out what caused the wound? Did he even care? And what became of the woman he'd dated? The one who'd shattered lives without a second thought. 2 years ago, I matched with someone who seemed almost too good to be true. His profile was everything I could have dreamed of: successful, philanthropic, and kind-hearted. He wasn't just wealthy. He'd made millions through a groundbreaking software invention and used his fortune to give back in ways that resonated deeply with me. Articles online painted a picture of a brilliant, selfless individual. He'd donated countless computers to underserved students in developing countries and given substantial funds to charities working in sectors I was passionate about. For someone like me, working in philanthropy and striving to make an impact in the world, meeting someone who shared those values was thrilling. I'd grown tired of dating guys who were either too detached or had no direction in life. This was someone who seemed like a real partner, someone with drive, compassion, and a sense of purpose. When we arranged to meet, I was filled with anticipation. But the moment he walked into the cafe, my excitement flickered, then dimmed. Something was off. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't showered in days. A thick gold chain hung awkwardly around his neck, clashing with the image I'd built of him in my head. And then there was his manner, subtle at first, but undeniably strange. He mumbled to himself occasionally, his lips moving as if he were in a private conversation with someone invisible. Still, I reminded myself not to judge too quickly. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he had quirks. It wasn't until the conversation started that I realized just how deep those quirks went. From the very beginning, he was intense. He told me, without hesitation, that he believed in astrology and conspiracy theories. Not just casual ones, but the kind that spiral into complete absurdity. He spoke about psychic powers as if they were an everyday reality, claiming he could manifest people into his life just by thinking about them. Whenever I need to hire someone, he said with a grin, I picture them in my mind, and within days they show up in my office. I forced a smile, unsure how to respond. He didn't stop there. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Anderson Cooper is a lizard person, he said seriously, nodding like he'd just shared the world's best-kept secret. I blinked, my brain scrambling to keep up. The logical side of me was ready to shut this down and leave, but I was also fascinated, morbidly curious about how far this conversation would go. This man, who had achieved so much, was sitting across from me talking about psychic powers and reptilian overlords. 2 hours passed in a blur of the strangest, most surreal conversation of my life. And keep in mind, I work with traumatized children displaced from their homes. I thought I'd seen and heard it all. But this was on another level. When the date ended, I politely declined his immediate request for a second. He nodded, seemingly unbothered, but an hour later my phone buzzed. How about a trip to Paris, he wrote. All expenses paid. Just you and me. We'll leave next week. I stared at the message, stunned. When I said no, he escalated. What if I offered you a $150,000 job at my company? Another no. Okay, for $100,000. Final offer. It was baffling. Here was this man throwing money and opportunities at me, as if they could buy my interest, completely oblivious to the fact that I wasn't looking for wealth or grand gestures. I wanted connection, depth, someone grounded in reality. This was the opposite of that. Over the next 6 to 8 months, he continued to reach out sporadically. His messages were bizarre updates about his life, tech deals he'd closed, pictures of himself in exotic locations, musings about his charity work. Sometimes he asked for advice, like I was some sort of consultant for his personal and professional life. I kept my replies brief and polite, hoping he'd take the hint. Eventually, he stopped messaging. He faded into the background, though his Instagram profile occasionally popped up in my, you might consider following, suggestions. I blocked him everywhere, unwilling to leave even a digital door open for him to step through. Looking back, it's almost funny. He wasn't a bad person, just profoundly strange. I think he genuinely believed everything he said, including the conspiracies and psychic powers. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he was searching for something no amount of money or success could give him. Either way, I've never forgotten that date. It was a lesson in appearances, in how someone can seem perfect on paper, but turn out to be something entirely unexpected. And to this day, whenever I hear someone mention lizard people, I can't help but think of him. What a weird guy.